Welcome back to our review of contract law. We're ready to start on main question 1 in contract law. Remember, we've broken down this entire field into 3 different questions, right? Has a legally enforceable contract been created? Has that contract been successfully performed? And finally, if not, what are the remedies for breach? Now we're going to start with question number 1, contract formation. Has an enforceable contract been formed? In other words, what does it take to get one of these contract things anyway? Now we're going to be discussing 4 big topics in this area. First, the agreement process, or offer and acceptance. Second, consideration, and also some related theories about when you have to keep your promises. Third, defenses to contract formation. These are things like incapacity or duress, that sort of thing. And finally, something called the statute of frauds. If you want something to help you remember this, right, you might think of this as ACDS. All contracts don't stink. You can actually have some really nice contracts. We're going to be working through our ACDS over the next several series of lectures. Now let's start with the agreement process itself. And just a quick word to the wise. This is something that law professors love to test on, right? The agreement process can have lots of back and forth. There can be some nuances here. So this is something that sometimes you may see on your exam. Now, a contract is typically created by an agreement. And obviously an agreement can be broken down into the offer and into the acceptance, right? So we might have an offer, will you go to the football game with me? We might have an acceptance where they say, sure. Or we might have something called a counteroffer, right? Which it says, how about we go skating instead? And then the process begins all over again. What we want to do is look a little more closely at each of these, the offer, the acceptance, and the counteroffer, all of which make up part of the agreement process. So let's start with the offer. What's an offer? Well, an offer is just a manifestation of a willingness to enter into an agreement. The person that makes that is called the offeror, and it's going to create a power of acceptance, the power of acceptance in the offeree. Right? So what's a very simple example? I will buy your car for $5,000, right? That's an offer. Now this may sound very obvious, but there are some nuances to offers, and I think it's a little bit easier to remember how this works by animalizing the process, And I've brought some props. So I want you to think of the offer as a caterpillar, right? Cute, fuzzy, but ultimately very fragile. Now, if you accept the offer, then this thing called the caterpillar turns into a beautiful butterfly, right? You've got a contract, and it's a thing of beauty that you'll remember forever. But until it's accepted, right, you just have this offer, this caterpillar squirming around on the ground. And remember, caterpillars are very fragile. Offers are very fragile. Once squashed, right, once the offer is destroyed, you can't scrape up a dead caterpillar off the ground and turn it into a butterfly, right? It's squashed. You can't revive it. Okay, how do you create a legal offer? 4 major points to cover here. First, offer and acceptance are governed by the objective test. And all this means is that outward appearances of words and actions is what matters, right? The outward appearances of your words and actions is what matters, not your secret intentions, right? The key question is whether the offeror displays an objectively serious intent to be bound. Let's take a look at problem number 8. I offer to sell you my Jeep Wrangler for $5,000, but I have my fingers crossed behind my back. And in my mind, I'm thinking, of course I don't mean it. There's no way I'll ever sell the Jeep to you. If you say, okay, do we have a contractual agreement? The answer is yes. It doesn't matter what's subjectively going through my mind. The objective test is going to control, and so I am going to be bound by that offer that I made, even though in my mind I may not have thought I was really making a serious offer. Now, the way to catch one of these problems is to look for situations involving humor or anger. Those are things to watch out for, where the offeror may not be displaying a serious intent to be bound under the objective test. Take a look at problem 9. You see me on the side of the road with the hood of my Jeep Wrangler open, and wires are everywhere. I'm pulling and yanking at wires, and I kick the side of the Jeep and yell out, "I'd sell this stupid junker for $5. You drive by and you yell out the window, "I accept!" Do we have a contractual agreement? No, right? No. Under the objective test, I'm not displaying a serious intent to be bound. I don't really want to sell this. I'm just really upset. What about expressions of opinion? Take a look at problem 10. We are talking casually in the law school parking lot when I lean up against my Jeep Wrangler and I ask you, "Hey, how much do you think this old thing is worth?" And you reply generously, "I don't know, maybe about $10,000. And I say, "I accept." Do we have a contract? No, right? No. You need a serious intent to be bound, right? You didn't have a serious intent to be bound. You weren't making me an offer. You were just expressing an opinion. Second point related to offers. The offer must usually be directed to a specific offeree. In other words, you can't accept an offer unless it's directed at you. Problem 11. You hear that there are a bunch of good deals to be had on Wall Street. So you walk down through the trading pit and you say, "I accept, I accept, I accept." Do you have any contracts with these stock traders? No, right? These offers aren't specifically directed towards you. You can't accept an offer that's not directed your way. Now, there is one limited exception here for contest offers or reward offers where there's a promise where someone promises something to anyone that accomplishes a certain task. This isn't really an exception to the rule, right? It's just they're extending that offer to anyone that wants to accept. It's an open offer to anyone. Take a look at problem 12. I've lost my pet cat named Monster, and I take out a newspaper advertisement promising $100 to anyone who finds my cat by this Friday. You see the ad, you find Monster, and you come by my house on Thursday to collect the reward. Do we have a contractual agreement? Yes. Yes. This isn't the way we normally contract, but if you have a situation like this with a reward offer that's spread out, broadcast to the entire world, then anybody can accept that offer if they do what the offer asks them to do. Third, how specific must your offer be? Here we have two slightly different rules for our two different parallel universes. Remember, we have common law universe and UCC universe, and the two universes treat this slightly differently. At common law, all essential terms must be covered in the agreement. This typically means the parties, the subject, the price, and the quantity. Those are the key terms. Now, our UCC universe is a little less strict. Here, the law is more willing to plug the gaps and to find a contract even though the agreement leaves out a few key terms. Generally, you need to only identify the parties, the subject, and the quantity under the UCC. And importantly, the price does not normally need to be stated. You might consider making a notation in your margins of your lecture outline here, right, to trigger some sort of a DNA trick, right? I like to draw a little spiral or something that represents a double helix or anything, right, that will allow you to remember that there's a little bit of a trick here that may be going on. Let's do some examples, and I think this will illustrate. Problem 13. Beth offers to pay Seth $50 every week to wash her car each Saturday for the next year. Is this deal covered by the common law? Yes. You should recognize that we're in common law universe, right? This is a service contract, not a goods contract. Is it a valid offer? Yes. It names the parties, the subject, the price, and the duration, right? The quantity of the washes. So there's no problem with this contract. There's no problem with this offer. Look at 14. Beth offers to pay Seth a fair price every week to wash her car for the next year. Is this a valid offer? No. In the common law universe, you have to typically state the price. So the answer to 14 should be no. Let's continue with 15. Bob offers to buy 500 windshield wiper blades next week from Sue for $5 each. Is this deal covered by the common law? No. You should recognize by now that this is not covered by the common law. This is a physical, tangible good. We are in our UCC universe. The answer is no. Is this a valid offer? Sure, it's a valid offer, right? Sure, we've got everything we need here in order for it to be a valid offer. Now take a look at problem 16. Bob offers to buy 500 windshield wiper blades next week from Sue for a fair price. Is this a valid offer? Yes. The answer to 16 is yes, right? You should draw a little line, connect it back up to your double helix spiral, right? Your trick up at the top of the page, right? The answer to 14 is no, but the answer to 16 is yes, because in the UCC universe, we're more forgiving about using a fair price, and so that's going to be good enough to count as an offer. Now look at 17. Bob offers to buy windshield wiper blades next week from Sue for a fair price. Is this a valid offer? No. The answer to 17 is no. Why not? There's no quantity term, right? There's no quantity term in 17. And if we're, in UCC universe, if someone doesn't list a price, right, we can read in a fair price, and there's enough volume, presumably, that we can figure out what a fair price for that good should be. But if someone doesn't tell us quantity, there's no way for us to gap fill on that. We have no idea of knowing whether they're talking about one windshield wiper blade or 5,000 or 500,000, and so that contract is not going to be good enough. That offer is not going to be valid. Finally, take a look at problem 18. Bob offers to buy all the windshield wiper blades that I need for the next 10 years from Sue at a fair price. Is this a valid offer? The answer is yes, as a requirements contract. As a requirements contract, right? You have set a quantity here. You just don't know for sure what the exact amount is going to be. But Bob has set a quantity, right? All the windshield wiper blades that he requires, that he needs for the next 10 years. You might recall the difference between a requirements contract and an output contract. What are we talking about? These are two different types of contracts where the quantity isn't explicitly specified, but nevertheless, they're going to be okay. They're going to be sufficiently definite enough to count as a real offer. A requirements contract is a situation where you say the following. I don't know how many I need over the next X years, but I promise to buy all of them from you. An output contract is the flip side of that. Imagine you're a farmer, right, and you're producing some sort of a crop on your land, and you may say to someone, look, I don't know how much I will be able to make or produce over the next X years, but I promise that whatever I make on this land, I will sell all of it to you. Both of those are perfectly fine for offers, right? We don't have the exact amount, but there's been a formula that we can use to determine what that amount will be, and those should be understood as legally binding contracts. Fourth, a valid offer must give the power of acceptance to the other side. In other words, what you want to do whenever you see something that may or may not be an offer, it's really close to being an offer, is look at the language and say, could the purported offeree simply say, I accept, and know that they have concluded the deal? And know that they've concluded the deal. If the other party could say, I accept to that statement, and everyone would know they've concluded the deal, then you may have an offer, right? You've conferred the power to the accept to the other side. Here are two common fact patterns that kind of test this concept. First, invitations to deal are preliminary communications, right, that still reserve a final round of approval with the speaker. In other words, mere invitations to deal may not confer a power of acceptance to the other side. You want final approval rights. You're just beginning the negotiations. Related to that, advertisements are usually understood as invitations to deal. You put out an advertisement in the newspaper. That's not normally an offer. All you're doing when you put that advertisement out there is you're saying, hey, I'm willing to sell this sort of thing. Make me an offer for the advertised item. I'll probably accept. I'd like to deal in that. There are a few exceptions, however, to this notion that advertisements are not normally offers. First of all, think back to our reward advertisement, right? Think back to problem number 12 above in my Lost Cat Monster. That is good enough to count as a real offer, right? I've made it open to anybody, and I've specified the exact conditions that you need to do to accept it, and only one person can accept that, right? Part of the problem with having advertisements be offers is we're worried about someone putting out there as an advertisement, and they may run out of the product. We're not worried about that with my monster example. Second, advertisements that are very specific and leave nothing open to negotiation, including how the acceptance can occur, may be viewed as offers. You might recall the Lefkowitz fur stole case. This is a famous case illustrating that point that's often taught in contract law. Let's look at problem 19. I tell you that you had better decide fast if you want to buy my house, as I expect to have a ton of offers next week. You say, I accept. Is this a contract? Probably not. Probably not. That's a close call case, but probably not. And the reason is, I seem to be reserving final approval of the deal with myself. I probably am not making you an offer. I'm saying, hey, you better hurry up if you want to make me an offer, right? And how do we know that? Well, I'm expecting to have lots of other offers next week. In other words, I haven't clearly conferred the power to accept over to you. I've reserved that final approval right to myself. Problem 20. I place an advertisement in the paper promising to sell my 1994 Jeep Wrangler for $5,000, first come, first served. You show up at my house waving a check and say, I accept. Is this a contract? Yes. Yes, right? Number 20 is an exception to our general rule that advertisements are not normal offers. In this case, I've told you exactly what it is that I'm selling. I've said how much it is. I've given a formula for determining who's going to be the party that is willing and able to accept it. And if you show up, first come, first serve, waving the check, you can accept that. That's specific enough that it's going to be an exception to our normal rule. All right, this is a pretty good time for us to take another break. Whenever you're ready, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about terminating the offers and the related subject of the irrevocable offer.